I have made a little presentation to try and put in an international context some of the things that you are all currently thinking about. So, if I may, I'm going to share my screen, or at least attempt to share my screen. Yeah, I have succeeded. So I think that what might be useful is for us today to consider 4 questions about cultural districts. Districts in English, they sometimes called quarters, precincts, clusters. But the first is, why is there currently internationally so much attention paid to this clustering of cultural activity? The second question is, what do we know about the success? And I want to say something not just about what success looks like, but what the conditions of success are. Thirdly, what are the principal drivers or catalysts or tools that one can use in the sort of in the creation of cultural districts, and drawing on the membership of the cultural district network that that Greg and others mentioned earlier. What is it that people are thinking about as being the problems that are most pressing and where they are most looking for interesting and creative solutions? So I will run through, if I may, these topics and give a sense. So the first thing it's worth saying about cultural districts is that they are as old as urbanism. They are spontaneous clustering of cultural activity is not dissimilar from the spontaneous clustering of other forms of activity, and it occurs naturally. And when people talk about naturally occurring cultural districts, they're talking about a phenomenon that dates back to at least the 15th and 16th centuries. If you go to Cremona in Italy, you will see a clustering of musical instruments makers. The clustering of any manufacturing process is a phenomenon that was studied in the 1870s by economists who understood that there are advantages, informational advantages, structural advantages of particular parts of industry clustering. Those naturally occurring districts are one very important phenomenon, and one that I want to return to because they form the basis of organized districts. And for at least the last 200 years, people have been thinking about proactively organizing districts. This is a picture of Museum Island in Berlin, which was started with a master plan by Schinkel in the 1830s. But it was based on the master plan, which took from right through to the mid 1930s to complete, was based on a naturally occurring district. Today, there are, as we think about districts, there are probably 3 things that are distinctive in the last 10 or 15 years. The first is that we are increasingly impatient, and therefore we work to faster timetables. And indeed, some of the timetables that we work to, some of the timeframes that we work to are extremely rapid, particularly in China, in the Middle East, where there's rapid urbanization. And a lot of the sort of organic coming together is much more difficult in those circumstances. The second thing is that our districts, not always, but are often much larger in scale than they have been historically. A district that covered 2 or 3 blocks in a city might have a reputation that might be very resonant 10 or 15 years ago. If you look at what are known as top-down districts like Dubai or West Kowloon, you will see absolutely enormous areas given over to primarily cultural purposes. I don't think we should be too diverted by that scale. There isn't a correlation between. There may be a correlation between scale and resonance, but there isn't necessarily a correlation between scale and long-term success. I think the other thing that is true of cultural districts now is that our expectations in policy terms are much, much more complex and ambitious than they've ever been. When we think about a successful cultural district, we are often thinking about what it does for social capital, what it does for economic development and innovation, what it does for tourism, what it does for the local community. In other words, as policy instruments, we often have extremely complex and sometimes conflicting ambitions and expectations for them, a point that I'll return to. So why is there all this emphasis on and interest in cultural districts these days? I think one obvious driver is globalization. Globalization means that ideas, people, capital goes around the world faster and faster as a result of two things. One is changes in technology, and the other is changes in legislative barriers. And what has happened, I suppose, over the period, the post-war period, or the post-Second World War period, and particularly from, say, the 1970s or 80s onwards, is that as that has happened and as urbanization has happened, cities, in a sense, have become commodified. That is to say, they look increasingly similar, they feel increasingly similar. And as those cities fight back to a certain identity, an identity that can attract capital, an identity that can attract inward investment, an identity that can attract knowledge workers, they've emphasized in their policies, obviously, initially public safety, transport, education, but cultural, in its broader sense, cultural identity has also been one of the things that has, if you like, decommodified cities, or that cities have sought to decommodify themselves with. So as you look at those cities that have invested quite heavily in the development of districts, they're often those cities that are trying to attract inward investment, attract knowledge workers, attract tourists. So, and I'll return to this point. So if we're looking at the next chapter of globalization and possibly of globalization slowing down, it will be interesting to see whether those strategies that those cities have adopted are less in evidence. The second, I think, factor driving cultural districts is, as I mentioned, I mentioned clustering earlier on. I mentioned that in the 19th century, there was a great deal of analysis of the phenomenon of clustering. In the last 20 years or so, clustering and the importance of clustering for fostering innovation has become, again, a very, very popular and I think quite compelling idea in industrial economics. People like Michael Porter and his 5 forces, but many other analysts have all sort of reverted to the idea of the importance of clustering, and not just spontaneous clustering, but clustering that is seeded or that is fed. And so I think that the second driver, if you like, of an emphasis on cultural districts has been the larger emphasis on the political economy of clustering. The third, I think, is that one of the ambitions for districts, whether they're cultural districts, design districts, innovation districts, is that they offer the possibility of a growth model that is inclusive, a growth model that is sustainable, a growth model that takes into account the need for diversity and sustainability in a way that traditional growth models of investment often have not necessarily done. In other words, that there is at least a philosophy behind many cultural districts, which is broader than traditional economic growth and takes into account social ambitions too. Some thoughts about if those arguments are, if those are what have driven, if you like, cultural districts over the last 20 years or so, then there are clearly some thoughts that are relevant to, and that we should, as we move forward in thinking about cultural districts, take into account. The first is that in many cultural districts, not-for-profit arts and cultural organizations are often the prime movers, if you like. They are they are used as the primary anchor, not invariably, but often. And that may be effective, but it's only effective if those not-for-profits, arts and cultural organizations are themselves vital and are themselves sustainable and are themselves relevant to their communities. We have seen in many advanced economies in the West an investment in large-scale cultural infrastructure that is not always connected to or intelligently relating to its broader community. So if one is going to use cultural infrastructure as an investment tool, one needs to think very carefully about the vitality and sustainability of the organizations that will occupy them. A second, I think, point about the model is that closely in the public mind, in the mind of many policy analysts, creativity and innovation and the arts are closely aligned. And therefore, it is seen that an investment in the arts is also an investment in creativity and innovation. That's partly true, but it's not wholly true. And if one wants to focus on creativity and innovation, there are many alliances between culture and technology, between culture and science, between culture and design, that are, if you like, a more fertile focus than one on culture alone. And therefore, in a sense, if you look at the balance of cultural districts, traditional art forms have sometimes been highly privileged in that mix, not always justifiably. The third point I mentioned already, which is if the pace of globalization slows, there may be a changing emphasis in cultural districts. And in a sense, it leads to the fourth point, which is cultural districts have often been developed in the context of tourism and in the context of high-end cultural tourism. But they are just as important potentially and can contribute just as much to the quality of life of a community. And the emphasis on tourism is extremely important in terms of economic development, but that tourism only works when those districts also have a strong root in their local communities. What do we know about success? Well, at one level, the attributes of success in cultural districts are really quite easy to recognize. It's harder, as I will suggest, to create those conditions, but we can recognize them relatively easily. Those districts that you think about, if you think about them warmly and you think about them as places that you would like to go to, that you would like to occupy, then the attributes are, first of all, human scale. It's critically important that when one's thinking about the design of cultural districts, when one's thinking about the creation of them, the support of them, that one takes into account human scale. Giantism, which is not, I think, an issue in Colombia, but it is in many countries where people lead with large-scale cultural infrastructure projects, is not conducive to the creation of spaces that that people can relate to. So the first thing I would say is think about human scale. This, many of you will know, is the Piazza del Campo in Siena in Italy, which is one of the most renowned public spaces and civic spaces in the world. Its scale is relatively small, but everybody looks at it and responds positively to the human scale. Second, the creation of safe public places. Safety is important. Public is important. A critical element in successful cultural districts is ensuring the civic realm is protected. So, and that the civic realm is genuinely democratic in character, that it is genuinely welcoming, that people not only are physically safe, but feel safe in those spaces, and that those spaces are spaces to watch and be watched, that they are not privatized, that if there is security, the security has a light touch, it's not invasive. Incredibly important in terms of the character of these spaces. Third, they are animated by light programming. That is to say that there is some entity which is responsible for public programming of the public areas, and that public programming is approached not as in a way that makes it fully intensely programmed always. That is not usually, that usually turns something into it gives it a very different character, and it gives it a character often that people won't go to casually. They won't just wander there. They'll only go when there is a specific event they want to see. But light public programming, street fairs, food, public art, occasional performance, amateur performance, intelligently programmed, gives life and vitality. And it requires experienced programming, experienced programming intelligence that can create a cycle and a rhythm of intensity and then less intensity and intensity and less intensity. Also celebrating, local festivals, the calendar to an annual cycle. And that requires, obviously, the infrastructure to do it. One of the things about those public spaces is, and it's easily done if you think about it at the beginning, is to make sure that those public spaces have in them, often set into the streetscape, opportunities for performance, for casual performance, for small atria, etc., where you can set up easily, where you can set up easily for events. Nighttime and daytime programming, nighttime and daytime activity. It's important when thinking about cultural districts to think not necessarily 24 hours a day, but at least usually 18 hours a day, and to think about the cycle of night use and daytime use. One historic challenge of, say, theater districts has been, what are they during the day? Where is the activity during the day? Equally, where there are clusters of museums and galleries, what's happening during the night? Thinking about the programming and the usage and the zoning to ensure that there is consistent animation during daytime and nighttime, extremely important. There was a tendency in the 90s and early 2000s, Dallas is a good example of this, of investment in what I think of as sort of monocultural cultural districts, in which there were museums, performing arts spaces, etc. Really quite significant public sector investment, but without thinking about, without the intelligent thoughts being applied to diversity of usage. The most successful cultural districts generally have an identity that is defined by the cultural element or the creative element, but they're also mixed use. They also have residential, they also have retail, they sometimes have office space. In other words, the most successful cultural districts are not monocultural. They're not exclusively around culture. They mix culture into the fabric of other mixed uses. And therefore, that sort of mix between residential, cultural, retail, restaurants, etc., is immensely important in the early planning stages to understand that. Equally, often they have some anchor cultural or similar use. In other words, there is usually at least one anchor institution, predominantly cultural, probably of larger scale than the others, that gives some sort of symbolic expression to the district. If you think about, for example, Brooklyn, it's Brooklyn BAM, Brooklyn Academy of Arts. There's a large organic district, very vital, but it's BAM that sort of defines that area. Similarly, where this is obviously a very large one, the Centre Pompidou, the Pompidou Centre defines the area. There is a great deal of other activity, but thinking about what the anchor is and whether that district needs a definitional anchor is an early part of cultural planning. Differences of scale, clearly important. From larger scale, we just talked about anchors, through to smaller scale, both organizations of all scales, rather than simply thinking about who the large guys are. And importantly, and often quite difficult, and we'll come back to this, a combination of cultural production and cultural consumption. If you think about what gives character to a cultural district, it's often the co-location of cultural production, that is to say, the making of work, the production of work, and cultural consumption, the enjoyment of that work. But what happens when cultural districts are successful often is that over time, prices rise, property prices rise, and it pushes cultural production away from cultural consumption. And that in turn alters fundamentally the character of the area. So thinking in one's early planning about how one can continue to co-locate cultural production and cultural consumption is very important. If you think about the High Line in New York, for example, the High Line has been immensely successful. It was anticipated that it would have a couple of 100,000 visitors a year. The High Line as a linear urban park has, I think, about 6 million visitors a year. But in doing so, it has forced up property prices and fundamentally altered the character of the area. In some ways, you might call that success, but in another way, it's unable to capture the benefits of those uplifts, and therefore the cultural production that was historically in that area has moved away from it. I'll say a little bit more about that and gentrification in a moment. Other criteria of success: it should be walkable, should be legible, usually neither totally pedestrianized, which gives an area a sort of overly sanitized feel, nor overwhelmed by traffic, clearly. But it's often, I think, there's maybe a subjective judgment, but certainly in my view, when you totally pedestrianize an area, you can you can adversely affect the character by giving it a slight artificiality. And that also goes for branding. Branding is very important for cultural districts, the assertion of a cultural identity. But when they are overly branded and overly aggressively branded, you can sort of create a slightly alienating effect. So branding needs to be quite subtle, and it needs to relate the city very, very clearly back to, relate the district back to the character of the city. So those are some of the criteria. Those are some of the things that when sees a successful cultural district, one sees many of those attributes. And I'm not saying that all successful cultural districts have all those attributes, but generally there is a high correlation between what people instinctively think of successful, i.e. vibrant, attracting tourists, but also an amenity to a local community. But of course, the challenge is how on earth does one achieve those things? In other words, if the signs of success are relatively straightforward, how much more complicated is creating them? And I think there's an interesting story in the South Bank, London's South Bank. So London's South Bank, which is a cornucopia of culture, which includes the Tate Modern, the Shakespeare's Globe, Royal Festival Hall, and the whole of that sort of area in the opposite the Houses of Parliament in London, where you can walk along a beautiful beautiful waterfront for about, I would say, from where that big wheel is through to through the Tate, then onto Tower Bridge. So it has many of those attributes that I just described. But behind those, there are some of the sort of the larger lessons, if you like, of what it takes to have a successful cultural district. And I think that these apply not only to the sort of swaggering large ones like London, but also more community-based ones. The first is that in order to make that happen, there needed to be a strong coalition between the voluntary sector, the private sector, and government. That is to say that there was a common understanding, an understanding that went beyond the electoral cycle, of the importance of a strategic approach to planning across the entire area. And this crossed, if you like, different boroughs in London. So a strong civic political coalition is often very important in these. Second, there was an understanding right from the beginning of the importance of the public domain, by which I mean that you can imagine along a piece of real estate like this, the temptation both of developers and of planners to sacrifice the larger picture to an individual development opportunity. But somehow over a 10, 15, 20-year period, through both intelligent zoning and the implementation of that zoning, they managed to hold the civic realm and protect the civic realm, so that as different development opportunities arose, they were looked at from the perspective of a master plan that included significant public space. Otherwise, the whole of that area along the riverbank would have been occupied by private entities and wouldn't be a public or civic space. And I think the third lesson that you can learn from a successful cultural district like this is that the local community was consulted from the inception, and that from the inception there was a deep preoccupation with ensuring that this served not only the economic interests of the city in its promotion, but also the economic and social interests of the immediate community. And that community, which is to the south of the river, genuinely has a place in here. There is social housing. There are much, as well as the large anchors like Tate or South Bank, there are much smaller organizations that serve the local community. There are most of the larger employers have an obligation which they respect to prioritize local employment. So So there is a strong a strong local community interest in and structures to accommodate the views of that local community. So I think what I'm saying is that when you look at those larger, when you look at those earlier criteria, underneath them there are those three essential things. There is a strong coalition between public, private, and not-for-profit. There is a long-term view of the public domain, and there is a commitment to community engagement from the inception of the project. So, uh, and perhaps it's worth mentioning, everybody knows this, this is Bilbao and the Guggenheim's great success in Bilbao. You know, it's of a vast scale, but, you know, sometimes these larger projects do have interesting lessons. I think there's a fourth lesson here that I'd emphasize, which is this is a jewel in the crown, if you like, but there is a crown. In other words, that uh, these big civic buildings only work if there is, in the case of Bilbao, a transport policy, a housing policy, a larger investment context in which they're placed. And sometimes when they don't think about these things, you have examples like this. I think this always makes me sort of want to cry a little. This is I think of this as the sort of an example of cultural infrastructure investment that has not been thought through. This is the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland, Ohio. If you're thinking about how do you make it, you know, porous, welcoming to the community, etc., you look at that and you think, what were they thinking? So, you know, it is easy to make mistakes in this game. You know, one way of thinking about it is when you're thinking about planning cultural districts naturally occur, and we can go and see those naturally occurring districts. And we might think that, you know, we see those attributes of success, we can just recreate them. But that's a bit like thinking that if you're a wild orchid, if you're collecting wild orchids, you can just pick up the orchid and put it somewhere else that will grow. But if you're cultivating orchids, what you've got to think about are the soil conditions. And I think when we're talking about things like long-term planning, partnerships, etc., protection of the civic realm, that is the soil in which the cultural districts thrive. Let me just say a little bit about from the network that Greg briefly described earlier on, some of the things that keep people up at night as they're thinking about the planning of these districts. And I'm going to just run through, as it were, what you might think of as the current agenda, the current intellectual and policy agenda of people who are thinking about cultural districts around the world. And some of this may resonate with you, others may resonate less, but the first is a pretty obvious one, which is, where do we find people with the skills and sensibilities required to plan and manage cultural districts? And I think I'm talking to a group of them, where you are interested simultaneously in the conditions of cultural and creative success and urban planning. And it's that cross section, if you like. It's that crossroads between urbanism and cultural policy that I think requires a particular interdisciplinary expertise. And if you look at some of those cultural districts that have historically been less successful, it's often because they were planned without necessarily the skills and understanding of both the urban dimension and the cultural dimension. Second thing that preoccupies people planning districts is, what is the appropriate relationship between tourism and community? I put in there education innovation too, but basically many cultural districts, understandably, are there to attract tourists because cultural tourists tend to A, come back more often, B, stay longer, C, spend more. And cultural tourism has become a very important part of the equation. But it's also important that that districts serve their local communities, and those districts that only serve tourists, particularly in the larger cities, often over time hollow themselves out for the reasons that we described. So thinking about the meaningful relationship and the authentic relationship between the visitor and the resident is an extremely important part of getting the successful policy mix. The animation, I've already talked about this a little, but the animation and of public spaces, the successful programming of those spaces in ways that attract both tourists and local community, and ensuring safety, the critical element of public safety, in ways that are non-intrusive is extremely important. Content and programming partnerships, that is to say, one of the things that these districts are thinking about, and the districts in the network, is the co-commissioning of public art, the co-commissioning of public, in order to create a touring circuit between cultural districts. This may be something that on a local level may be relevant to Colombia, where you may have the opportunity to co-commission and therefore allay costs for public art that then moves around between districts. Again, I mentioned earlier, but incredibly important, the co-location of production and consumption in ways that are successful in the long term, so that you can capture the value of increases in property values for the benefit of the local community and for the cultural infrastructure. We recently commissioned a report, which is on the GCDN website, called Capturing Value and Preserving Identity, that looks at all these things in depth, and the techniques for example, land banks, zoning, etc., in which you can begin to capture the value of the success, the long-term success, that capture where there is long-term success, where you can capture that value for the benefit of the project and the community. If you don't do that, then of course the danger is that over time the beneficiaries of the intended beneficiaries of a cultural district are not the actual beneficiaries. How do you ensure that anchors understand the larger civic agenda? That is to say, often if there is investment in a particular cultural institution, a theater or something, as the anchor, it's important they understand their responsibilities as anchors. Their responsibility is not only for what goes on in the building, but also the relationship of that institution to the wider community. Some cultural institutions understand that deeply, others less so. And so it's important that one ensures that the management understands their larger responsibilities to the community. Ongoing revenue support, and through what mechanism? There are a series of mechanisms. Bids are very popular in the States, where there is where the business community chips in, contributes to the public benefit. There are various systems of governance, but one needs a system of governance and a business model that ensures there is a generation of funding for ongoing programming and maintenance of the civic realm. It's immensely important. If one just has capital support for the creation of public spaces, but not the revenue to program them, then the results are often significantly less distinguished. We are currently entering what I think generally is internationally known as a period of non-incremental change, whether we'll come to some of the things, but the climate crisis is clearly one. The long-term impact of series of COVID related or pandemic related disruption is another. Thinking through what that means for tourism, what that means for public spaces, what that means for gathering is an immense preoccupation currently, and ensuring the sustainability in all senses of cultural districts is probably the biggest single issue cultural leaders are thinking about currently. Greater salience of racial equity and social justice, how one incorporates and ensures that, along with the ambitions for cultural or economic or social generation, there is an explicit commitment in districts to issues around equity has become immensely important. Getting the right voices around the table for planning and for subsequent governance. It's often the case that the loudest voices loom very large in decision-making early on. The community is not necessarily at the table. Property developers can be at the table. Government is often at the table. But trying to create a forum early on in which the right voices are heard around the table, important. The metrics of success. This is something on which GCDN has done a great deal of work. Again, it's all available on the website. But it's not just economic impact, but social impact, educational impact, artistic value. And one of the things that this group of 50-odd districts are doing are developing a common language of metrics so that they can articulate, measure, and develop, measure and promulgate criteria for success in a common framework, potentially useful. Climate, sorry, I mentioned climate, and then I've also mentioned COVID. So it's a very full agenda. There are many things to think about, but what I would say is that this is an extremely exciting time for people who are interested in the contribution that culture can make to urban. Is really what cultural districts are. Their simplest are a way of thinking holistically about the contribution of strategic investment in culture to urban development. So I hope that gives you at least something to think about as you're thinking about the Colombian context. And I thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Adrian. Saludo a todos y todas quienes nos acompañan esta mañana. There are a couple of questions for you, Adrian. I don't know if you're still with me.
I'm totally with you, but I'm also aware of the very tight timetable that you have. So
if we can blaze through, there is one question from Luisa Mejia who says, "What kind of governance model do you suggest in order to ensure cultural district success?"
I think you need to think about models for the planning, and they're slightly different from models for operation. I think the model for planning needs to it often requires a central agency and then extensive consultation around that, extensive and transparent consultation. The model for operation, that is to say, when a cultural district has been established, I would suggest that it probably needs it needs to be at arm's length from government. It needs to have government represented on it. It also needs to have the commercial interests represented on it, as well as the cultural interests. And then, and this is often the most challenging, community interests. It's the most challenging because you have to make decisions about or you have to make choices, I should say, rather than decisions about how you ensure the authentic voice of community to be heard in it. But generally, that in most countries that we worked in, I think it is a not-for-profit entity on which there is representation of government and private sector interests, as well as cultural community and local community.
Thank you. And the second one comes from Yuli Guerrero, and it's, how can we convince the private sector, firms, companies, and businesses to join a cultural district project? In the sense of, how do you show the cultural district's attractiveness to the private sector?
Well, I think the funny thing is there. I think that over the last 10 or 15 years, developers have increasingly understood the benign impact on capital values of culture, of being adjacent to culture. And therefore, they have often become supporters of investment in culture because not through any sort of philanthropic largesse, but because they have seen what it does for property values. So the challenge is to share some of that value, but also to capture some of that value, not for the developer, but for the benefit of the project. One of the, if you take, and let's just take something very simple. Let's just take an art gallery that is adjacent to a residential, a residential development. That art gallery, it depends on the character of that residential development, but that residential development will probably be worth more as a result of being adjacent to that art gallery. So who pays for the art gallery? The public is paying for the art gallery. The developer is the beneficiary of it. It's a matter of capturing some of that uplift. The larger the development, the easier that is. And I think that one of the reasons why we have seen, throughout the world, these really large-scale developments, whether these very large-scale developments, really quite significant investment by the developer in culture, often in partnership with the city, it's for exactly that reason. So I think the answer is the answer lies in a bottom line oriented argument, but it requires the public sector to be involved too, because the public sector controls zoning, and where there is density and development pressure, that zoning can be used that zoning can be used to ensure that some of the value of the commercial development is transferred into the public domain.